The moment my flight landed in Denver, all I could think about was getting home to my son. I'd been in Portland for 4 days, a mandatory audit review my company sent me on, and the whole time I was gone, I kept texting my husband asking about Noah. Simple questions. Did he eat? Did he sleep okay? How was soccer practice? My husband Marcus always replied with the same 2 words, all good. Sometimes just a thumbs up emoji. I told myself that was just how he was. Not a big communicator. Not a worrier like me. I should have looked closer at what he wasn't saying. It was a Tuesday evening in early March when I came home. The sky outside was that particular shade of gray Denver gets before a late winter storm rolls in, heavy, pressing down on everything. I remember the cold hit me the second I stepped off the shuttle. I pulled my coat tighter and thought about Noah's face when he'd see me walk through the door. He was 6. He still ran to me. That was the thing about 6. They still ran to you. I took a cab from the station instead of asking Marcus to pick me up. I wanted to surprise him. I thought it would be a nice thing, a small romantic gesture after 4 days apart. I even stopped at a bakery near our house and bought a cherry pie, Noah's favorite, still warm in the box. I don't know what I expected when I unlocked the front door. Probably the tea beyond. Maybe dinner smells. Marcus wasn't a great cook, but he tried, and usually by 7 there was something on the stove. What I didn't expect was my sister's voice. I heard her before I saw her. That particular laugh she has, the one that sounds like she's performing it for an audience, loud and rising at the end. I stood in the entryway holding the pie box and my rolling suitcase, and I just listened for a second, confused. My sister Diane didn't just drop by. We weren't that kind of close. We were the kind of sisters who texted on birthdays and saw each other at Thanksgiving and kept a careful, polite distance the rest of the year. There was no reason for her to be in my house. I walked toward the kitchen. Diane was sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of my wine, the good Melbeck I'd been saving, laughing at something Marcus had just said. Marcus was at the stove, actually cooking, which he almost never did for me, stirring something that smelled like the garlic pasta I'd asked him to make 3 times in the last year, and he always said he didn't know how. There were candles on the table. My good candles, the ones I kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator for special occasions. Neither of them heard me come in. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen for what felt like a very long time. And then I looked around and I thought, where's Noah? He wasn't at the table. He wasn't on the living room couch. The TV wasn't on. The house had that particular kind of quiet that only happens when a child isn't in it, which is different from the quiet that happens when a child is sleeping. I knew the difference. I'd lived in both kinds of quiet for 6 years. Where's Noah? I said. They both turned at the same time. Diane's wine glass stopped halfway to her mouth. Marcus's expression went through about 4 different things very quickly. Surprise, then something that looked almost like guilt, then a kind of overcompensating casualness that I recognized immediately because I'd seen it before and ignored it. You're home early, he said. My flight wasn't early, it was the 7:15. I set the pie box down on the counter. Where is Noah? Marcus set down the wooden spoon. He's in the laundry room. I walked past both of them without saying another word. The laundry room was at the back of the house, past the bathroom, past the small hallway where we kept Noah's school backpack and his soccer cleats. The door was almost closed. I pushed it open. Noah was sitting on the floor between the dryer and the wall in the narrow space he sometimes squeezed into when he was scared or overwhelmed. He was in his pajamas even though it was barely 7 o'clock. He had his stuffed dog, the brown one he'd named Biscuit that he'd slept with every night since he was 2, pressed against his chest. He wasn't crying, he was past crying. He was in that exhausted, hollow place children get when they've already cried everything out and given up on anyone coming. He looked up at me and something in his face cracked open. "Mama," he said. Just that. I sat down on the laundry room floor in my work coat and I pulled him into my arms and he buried his face in my neck and I held him there for a long time without moving. He was cold. The laundry room was the farthest room from the kitchen, and it had no heat vent. He was in thin pajamas on a March night, and he was cold, and the man I'd married was 20 feet away making garlic pasta for my sister by candlelight. I didn't cry then. I want to be clear about that. Something happened instead that was quieter and more permanent than crying. It was like a door closing somewhere inside me, not slamming, just closing, with a soft, final click. I asked Noah quietly if he'd had dinner. He shook his head. I asked him how long he'd been in the laundry room. He said, "Since Aunt Diane came." I asked if he was okay. He nodded the way children nod when they're not okay, but have learned that nodding makes things easier. I carried him to the kitchen. He was almost too big for that, nearly 45 pounds. But I carried him anyway. "He hasn't eaten," I said to Marcus. Marcus started to say something. I didn't listen to what it was. I opened the refrigerator, found the leftover mac and cheese from what must have been the night before, and put it in the microwave. I kept my back to both of them while it heated. I could feel the silence in the room like a physical pressure. Diane said, "I should probably go." "That would be great," I said, still facing the microwave. She left. I heard her say something low to Marcus on her way out, and I heard the front door close, and then it was just me and Marcus and Noah in the kitchen and the microwave beeping. I fed my son. I gave him a bath. I read him 2 chapters of his book and sat with him until he fell asleep, with Biscuit tucked under his arm. Then I went back downstairs. Marcus was waiting in the living room. He'd cleaned up the kitchen, put away the good candles, washed the wine glasses, as if erasing evidence would change what I'd already seen. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed something and was hoping he'd get to use it. I sat down across from him and said, "Tell me what's been happening while I travel for work." He said it wasn't what it looked like. I said I wasn't asking what it looked like, I was asking what it was. What it was, over the course of an hour that I will not describe in full because some conversations leave marks and I don't need to press on them, was this. Diane had been coming over. Not just that week, for months. Marcus said it started as just friendly. She'd come by when I was away, keep him company. He said it was innocent. He said nothing physical had happened. He said this last part in a way that made me note it immediately because there is a particular way people say nothing physical happened that is specifically designed to leave room for everything else. I asked him about our joint savings account. He went very still. I'd checked it that afternoon on my phone in the cab for a routine reason. I'd wanted to confirm a transfer I'd made before my trip. What I found was that our balance was $47,000 less than it had been 6 weeks before. I knew our bills. I tracked our spending carefully, always had, because I was the one who'd built our savings from almost nothing over 7 years of working and saving while Marcus moved between jobs. $47,000 doesn't disappear into regular expenses. I'd done the math 3 times in the back of that cab, and then I closed my phone and watched Denver pass by outside the window and said nothing to anyone. "Marcus," I said now. "The account." He said he'd meant to tell me. He said Diane had gotten into some financial trouble, something about a failed lease agreement on a business she'd tried to start, and he'd loaned her money to help her get back on her feet. He said he planned to pay it back before I noticed. He used the word loan 4 times in 2 minutes, which is the kind of thing you notice when you're sitting very still and listening very carefully. I asked him how much. He told me $43,000. I built that money across 7 years. Saturday shifts at the accounting firm when we needed the extra hours. Skipped vacations. A used car instead of a new one. A savings account I checked the way some people check on sleeping children. Quietly, to make sure it was still there. Still safe. I said, "Did she ask you or did you offer?" He couldn't answer that quickly enough, which was itself an answer. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that too because the story is more honest that way. I didn't yell, didn't throw anything, didn't say any of the sharp-burning things that were sitting right at the back of my throat. I just looked at Marcus, this man I had married at 27, who had stood next to me at the county clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon and signed his name next to mine, and I thought about Noah on the floor of the laundry room in the cold and Diane laughing with my wine, and the way Marcus had said all good every single day I was in Portland. I said, I need you to sleep somewhere else tonight. He slept in the guest room. I lay awake until 3 in the morning, and then I got up and called my friend Priya, who was a paralegal and would understand why I was calling at that hour. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said, Don't move any money. Don't talk to Diane. Call a family attorney first thing tomorrow morning and write everything down tonight while it's fresh. I wrote everything down. Dates, amounts, what Marcus said, how Noah was found, how long Diane had apparently been coming to my home. I wrote it all in the Notes app on my phone at 3:15 in the morning while the city was quiet and Noah slept down the hall. The attorney's name was Sandra Okafor. Priya had worked with her before and said she was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste your time or money on emotions. She saw me that Thursday morning. I brought my notes and a printed bank statement I'd requested that morning. Sandra reviewed everything without any visible reaction. Then she looked at me and said, The transfer of funds from a joint account to a third party without your knowledge or consent is a recoverable matter. Whether it rises to the level of financial misconduct within your marriage is something we will establish. What I need from you is this: do not confront your sister. Do not access any further accounts until I advise you. Do not have any conversation with your husband about the money that isn't documented. I said I understood. She said, I mean it about the sister. I know it's going to feel like the wrong move. It isn't. I said I understood that too. I want to tell you I followed her advice perfectly. I want to say I went home and waited quietly and trusted the process, and mostly I did, except for one afternoon, about 2 weeks after I'd seen Sandra, when Diane called me from a number I didn't recognize and I answered without thinking. She said she wanted to explain. She said Marcus had come to her, not the other way around. She said she tried to refuse the money, but he'd insisted. She was crying, or performing crying. With Diane, it was always hard to tell the difference, and I'd spent 30 years learning that I couldn't. I said, I need you to not contact me. She said, Maya, please. I said it again, calmly, and I hung up. I told Sandra about the call the next day. She noted it and said to document the number and time. She didn't tell me I'd done anything wrong, which I appreciated. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way divorce is sometimes dramatic in movies. It was methodical. Sandra filed for legal separation and simultaneously began the process of documenting the unauthorized transfer. The bank, once presented with the documentation showing I had not authorized or been consulted on any transfer of $43,000, began its own internal review. Sandra was careful to note that I was not alleging my husband had stolen from me in a criminal sense. What she was building was a civil record, a paper trail that would follow Marcus into any asset division and court proceeding. Marcus hired his own attorney. That attorney's first communication was a letter suggesting the money was a marital decision made in the normal course of their shared finances. Sandra read it to me over the phone in a tone that told me she found it instructive. She said, He's going to argue it was a joint decision. We're going to show that it wasn't. She was right, and the way she showed it was straightforward. My signature was not on any of the transfer paperwork. My email was not copied on any communication with Diane. There was no record of any conversation between me and Marcus about Diane's alleged business difficulty. There was no record of a loan agreement. There was, however, a record of a separate bank account Marcus had opened in his own name 8 months prior, into which $4,200 had been quietly moved in increments over the same period. I found out about the second account from Sandra, who had found it through the discovery process. I remember sitting in her office when she told me and thinking, very quietly, how long. Not in a devastated way. More like a person looking at a math problem they'd been trying to solve and finally seeing the part they'd missed. The answer, as best as Sandra could establish, was about 18 months. The closer relationship with Diane, the small financial moves, the deliberate absence from our marriage that I'd been chalking up to stress and personality. It had been building for a year and a half while I worked and saved and came home from business trips with cherry pies. I don't tell you this to make Marcus into a villain, exactly. because the truth is more complicated than that. He was someone I had loved and someone who had made choices I didn't make, and the distance between those two things is where the marriage actually lived and died. But I do think it's important to say, it was not an accident. It was not a moment of weakness. It was a sustained series of choices that he made while I was paying the bills and raising our son and trusting that all good meant all good. Noah was with me through all of it. I told him in the simplest true language I could find that his dad and I weren't going to live together anymore, but that we both loved him and that would never change. He asked if he would still see his dad. I said yes. He asked if Biscuit could come with him wherever he went. I said always. He seemed to find that sufficient in the way that 6-year-olds sometimes anchor their sense of security in the most honest objects available to them. The settlement was finalized on a Wednesday in late June, 4 months after I'd walked into my kitchen with a cherry pie and found my world rearranged. The terms included Marcus repaying the full $43,000 from the joint account as part of the asset division, plus an additional adjustment for the separate account. I kept the house. Marcus moved to an apartment across town. Our custody arrangement was equal. 3 days, 4 days, switching on Sundays. Diane repaid nothing directly. There was no legal mechanism for that, Sandra explained, since the debt was between her and Marcus, and my legal case was against Marcus only. I accepted that. Some things don't get resolved the way you want them to, because the law isn't built for every kind of wrong. What I did, the month after the settlement, was something small and practical that meant more to me than any courtroom outcome. I took the $43,000 that came back to me as part of the settlement and I opened a separate account in my name alone. Not joint. Not shared. Mine. I transferred my emergency fund into it. I set up automatic deposits. I looked at the balance for a long time the first morning it existed, and I thought about every Saturday shift and every skipped vacation and every careful, patient year. Then I closed the app and went to make Noah's breakfast. He wanted waffles. He always wants waffles. I made them with too much syrup the way he likes, and we sat at the kitchen table in the morning light, and he told me about a dream he'd had involving a dog the size of a school bus, and I listened to every word of it. And outside the window, Denver was doing that thing it does in early summer, where the sky is so blue, it almost doesn't look real. I thought about the woman who had stood in this kitchen 4 months ago, holding a pie box, waiting to be surprised by her own life. I felt something for her, something gentle and a little sad. She had worked so hard. She had trusted so completely. She had checked the savings account the way you check on sleeping children. I don't regret being her. I just don't live there anymore. I went back to work. I got a small promotion in August, a senior auditor position that came with a modest raise and the ability to work remotely 2 days a week, which mattered because it meant more mornings like this one. Sandra sent a handwritten note when I told her. Priya took me out for dinner and ordered the expensive wine and said, "I'm proud of you," in that direct way she has that makes it impossible not to believe her. Noah started first grade in the fall. He made a best friend immediately, a kid named Theo who also had a stuffed dog and also liked waffles, which Noah treated as conclusive evidence that they were meant to be friends. I met Theo's mom, Carol, at pickup one afternoon, and we ended up talking in the parking lot for 45 minutes. She was a nurse. She'd been through her own version of a hard year. We exchanged numbers and made plans for coffee that we actually kept. The last thing I want to tell you is this. About 3 months after the settlement, I was grocery shopping on a Saturday afternoon. Noah was with his dad that weekend. I was in the cereal aisle, which is a longer decision than it should be, when I turned the corner and walked directly into Diane. We both stopped. She looked the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy and are very tired from it. She said my name. I said her name. There was a silence that had many years in it, all the Thanksgivings, all the careful distances, all the things we'd never said to each other. She said, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything." I thought about all the things I could say. I had a whole inventory of them. I'd composed them at 3 a.m. over many months, and each one was true and earned. I said, "I know you are." And then I put 2 boxes of cereal in my cart and I walked to the next aisle. I don't know if that was forgiveness. I'm not sure it matters what we call it. What I know is that I walked out of that grocery store into a clear October afternoon, and I loaded the bags into my car, and I drove home to my house with my savings account and my kitchen table and the particular quiet that is just mine now, and I was okay. More than okay. I was free.